Hello, and welcome to week 3 of our spring webinar series. I am Sarah Wieland, and this is your host, Anna Kelly. We are broadcasting live from our hotel in Princeton, Minnesota. Our sales and customer support team is mostly remote at this time. I work from my home in northern Wisconsin, and Anna works from her home in Lincoln, Nebraska. Our team tries to get together in person once a month for team building and various strategy meetings. We had this meeting yesterday in Josh's barn with views of his sheep, horses, and highland cattle. What a treat. Also yesterday, Anna and our field technician, John O'Doherty, attended the second day of the Minnesota Irrigators program in St. Cloud. That was actually on Wednesday, not yesterday. So we are excited to have the opportunity to sponsor this event and support this educational opportunity for growers wanting to learn more about sustainable irrigation practices. This program is hosted by the University of Minnesota Extension and aims to educate growers on various irrigation practices to boost crop yields and save water. This was the inaugural Minnesota Irrigators program. There was very limited enrollment this year, but don't worry, they plan to hold this event annually at various locations throughout the state. I will link more information on this event in our blog and on the show notes on our YouTube channel. Like I said, this is week 3 of our webinar series. This week's topic is all about understanding soil moisture and soil moisture management. We will be recording every webinar in this series, so please check back on our blog, website, and YouTube channel to find the other recordings if you happen to miss a week. Now I will turn it over to Anna to get the soil party started. Hello, Anna.
Hi, Sarah. Can you see my screen? I believe I'm sharing.
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So, hi everyone. Like Sarah said, I'm Anna Kelly, the host of the webinar series. I'm a grow coach and agronomist here at EarthScout, and I really want to thank everyone who's hopping on the webinar with us this morning. Today actually marks the halfway point of the webinar series, which is really hard to believe. It's going by really fast. Like Sarah said, if you have missed any of our past webinars, those include our introduction to EarthScout and all about our different sensors webinar. You can always go back and watch those recordings on the EarthScout blog site or any of our social media platforms. We usually try to post those at least, a few hours after the webinar is over. Okay, so this week, week 3, soil moisture management, and we're going to focus a little bit more on the soil side of things today. So first, a little bit of soil basics. I'm a soil nerd, so I'll try to keep myself wrangled in here. I won't try to wander too much. But soil is comprised mainly of 4 components. We have our mineral components, which are soil particles. And we also have airspace. We have some of that soil space taken up by water, and then also organic matter. So mineral percentage is 45, air includes 25%, and water 25%, organic matter 5%. So these mineral particles that take up half of the volume of the soil, they'll have different sizes, and the composition or the mixture of these differently sized particles determines how a soil will behave. And you can just see here how different those particle sizes can be. So our largest particle size is a sand particle, and this is very coarse. You can see a sand particle with your eyes, with your naked eye, and there's different kind of textures of a sand particle. We have a coarse, medium, and fine. Then our next size particle is a silt particle, and you might be able to see that with your bare eyes, but it's a little harder. It's quite a bit smaller, as you can see, than a sand particle. And a clay particle, super, super small. You can only really see a clay particle with a microscope, basically. And then our organic matter can fall within any of these sizes. So organic matter can be as small as a clay particle, or it can be as big as a coarse sand particle. So it's important to kind of keep these particle sizes in mind, because these particles are affecting how soil behaves and how soil holds water. So our next slide here is kind of talking about soil texture and our pore space of soils. And again, like I said, the size of all of our little soil particles are going to determine the texture and the pore space. So our sandier soils, they have large pore spaces because they have larger soil particles, and water runs through a sandy or coarse soil fairly fast because these channels or these pore spaces are really large, and soil's able to just move right through them really quickly. In a clay or a silt dominated soil, they have smaller particles that are closer together, and they slow down the movement of water, which obviously means that our water is going to move very slowly, getting into the soil and then down through the soil. That's going to be fairly slow. Our loam soils or medium textured soils, they're kind of at a happy medium when it comes to pore space and things like that. They hold onto water moderately well, and they also have good drainage. So we're able to hold onto a lot of water while also letting a lot of water move through the soil. And you can figure out your soil's texture by using the texture by feel method. This is basically just scooping up some of your field soil, getting it wet in your hand, and just feeling it in your hands and kind of observing what are you feeling. So if it's a sandier soil, we might feel grittiness. And if we have a clay soil, it might be really sticky and it sticks to our hands. Or a silt soil, that might feel really smooth, like silky smooth, kind of like baby powder or flour, wet flour, baby powder in your hands, very smooth. And these two triangles here are the soil texture triangles, if you've never seen them. Like I was saying, loam, we have a great mixture here in the middle. Our clays, they can feel sticky when wet, sands are coarse, silt is smooth. And then over here on the right, we have another version of the soil texture triangle. So you can also send your soil into a lab and they will run analysis and figure out soil texture for you down to the percent. So they will figure out for you what is our percent clay, our percent silt, and our percent sand. So all these three need to equal out to 100. So we're all going to have everywhere across the world has different amounts of clay, silt, and sand in their soil. And so once you figure that out, you can follow these lines and figure out where all these lines intersect, and where they intersect, that will give you your soil texture or your soil type. So that's just a little bit about little basics on soil texture. So I find this graph really helpful. It kind of keeps everything in line for us. There's so many things to think about, and this kind of helps me at least visualize it. So soil texture is driving more than, just moisture. Our pore spaces are a balance of a lot of different physical characteristics, and the degree of, if we're compacted, if you have a compacted soil, the soil is kind of squished together and our pore spaces are depleted. There's not a lot in there, and that creates a problem. And when we're trying to get moisture down through the soil, there's no pore space for them to move through. And testing for texture alone does not account for, compaction, organic matter, and how these affect our soil moisture out in the field. So here on this table, across the top, we have our coarse textured soil on the left, and we can see that we have a low water and nutrient holding capacity. Our medium soils, our loams, are moderate when it comes to water and nutrient holding capacity. And then our clay, fine textured soils, they have a high holding capacity. But the next row down, we can see that our coarse textured soils, they infiltrate and they drain very fast. Our loam, our medium textured soils, again, they're moderate. They have good drainage. We're not draining out too much, and we're keeping that water there, keeping it available for the plant. And our clays, you can see we can hold a lot of water, but it takes a long time. It's very slow getting that water to go down lower into the soil profile. And then on our next slide, we're going to talk about some soil moisture terms. So this is kind of more of a visual view of that table that I was just talking about. But first, we're going to talk about some of these terms here on the table. So in soil moisture management, you might hear a lot of vocab terms, things thrown around, and you might not know what those mean. So we're going to start with saturation. And saturation point is the soil water content when all pores are filled with water. I like to think of it as like max capacity. If the soil is holding as much water as it possibly can, it is fully soaked. All of our pore spaces are filled with water, and that's not really the most ideal condition for a plant to be in, or roots to be in at all. Because there's no space for air in the soil. And luckily, the soil doesn't really stay at saturation point for a very long time. It will start to drain that water down to different levels. Now, field capacity, you can see that here on the graph, is the most water that a soil can hold without draining. So this is kind of after saturation, we've let the soil sit at saturation for a day or two, the water's kind of drained out. We call that gravitational water, and what is left, what the soil can hold, that is field capacity. And the next really important term is permanent wilting point. And this describes the percent of moisture at which plants can no longer extract water from the soil in the root zone. And if we get to this kind of degree of dryness in a soil for too long, at the best, our plants will be really stressed out. They're going to be really thirsty. And at the worst, we might not be able to recover from that wilt. So the plants will wilt and we'll put on water and they won't perk back up again. So sometimes permanent wilting point could mean we're not coming back, the plant's gone too far and we're not going to recover. So during, key life stages, we don't really want to get our soil moisture content down all the way down to permanent wilting point. That's kind of a dangerous place to be. But also plant hardiness and the age of the plant determines kind of permanent wilting point as much as the soil does, and just the different crops you're growing and then the soils you're growing, those are all going to kind of be a different combination. So these numbers that we see on this permanent wilting graph, they're not a hard number, it's just a guideline to go off of. Like I said, every soil and every field is going to be different. And another term we might hear is water holding capacity, which is the amount of water held by the soil against gravity, or the total volume of water in the soil at field capacity. Then there's a lot of terms I know, but the last term that I'm going to explain is plant available water, and this is the portion of the water at holding capacity that can be absorbed and used by the plant, and is the amount of water between field capacity and wilting point. So we'll kind of go through our three kind of main soil textures here on the graph. Kind of starting in the middle with our loams and our silt loams. These in agronomy are the soils we really like. These are medium textured soils. They have a great balance of all the different particle sizes, and we can really maximize our water holding capacity while also maximizing how much water is available to the plant. We can see in the middle, we can hold a fair amount of water and our wilting point is really low. So of all the water that's in the soil, there's quite a bit of it available to the plant to use. When we look at sandier soils, they're really great for crops that like a little bit more oxygen in their soil or on the roots, or when we're in a high rainfall kind of geography, it's good to have a sandy soil to get that water through the soil and we're not just getting flooded or waterlogged. Some crops that really like oxygenated soils are hemp, cannabis, tomatoes, melons, and kind of those different vegetable crops. If you're not irrigated, it can really be hard to grow on a sandier soil because you're going to need a lot of rain. And if you are irrigated, it can also be hard to manage that sandy soil because you're constantly having to water, you're constantly having to irrigate and keep your system running because the water is just moving through that sandy soil so fast. And as you can see on the graph here, we can hold a fair amount of water in a sandy soil and it's fairly available, but it's going to move through quickly and we can't hold that water there very long. And then our clay dominated soils here on the far right, we can see that they hold a lot of water, like total water, soil water content of a clay can be very high. But there is kind of a tipping point when it comes to clays where we can have so much water that it just becomes a sticky, muddy mess. And obviously that's not a great thing to have. But a lot of people look at clay and say, wow, look at how much water we can hold in there. But also that water is not very available. You can see that maybe 10 or 15% of all of that 50% water is actually available for the plant to use. Clay tends to hold on to water very tightly and it's hard for the plant to pull that water away from those soil particles. So clays and sands are kind of our extremes on both ends, and then our loams are kind of, like I was saying earlier, kind of our perfect kind of mixture if we can have that. All right, so there are some cultural practices or different management practices that can affect soil moisture. They have really direct effects on compaction and organic matter and pore space, which ultimately, when it comes down to it, will affect our soil moisture. I don't have a lot of time to go into the depths of all these different practices and how they directly affect soil moisture. But if you have a question, put that in the chat box and we can talk about it at the end of the webinar. But some different practices that can affect the moisture in your soil are what kinds of tillage are you using? Are you tilling up the field? Are you breaking up those soil particles? Or are you no-till? Are you just leaving it alone, not disturbing the soil? Running equipment across the field. So we think about how many times we're driving over the field at planting, spraying during the season, at harvest. All these tires and equipment going across the field can compact our soil, which again reduces our pore space, which is how water gets through the soil. Fertilizers and manure can affect a little bit of our soil moisture. Crop residues left from previous cropping years. Cover crops can affect our soil moisture, as well as the crop type and the rotation of crops that we're using. Those all directly affect, like I was saying, organic matter, pore size, and when it comes down to it, our soil moisture. This picture here on the left, these are different kinds of tillage equipment and how they kind of disturb the soil. And then on the right here, we have some native plants. It's also important to think about what's going on below the soil. Roots are a great way to break up compaction and increase pore space. Roots actually create little channels through the soil, and when roots die, those roots will decompose and leave these channels, which are kind of like pore spaces in the soil. But it's always important to think about, cover crops. They can really root down into a soil and improve a lot of different characteristics, as well as, what crops are we growing? Are they shorter roots, or are they deeper? So always be thinking about that as well. Next, this is something that a lot of people probably already know, but some people might not, is that field uniformity in a field being the same across an entire field doesn't really exist unless we're at a very, very small scale. No field has the same soil texture throughout it. So things like topography can really affect it. Our elevation of the field can affect that as well. We can even have different textures and different topographies throughout a field. And some of our soil textures can even have different organic matter content and microbial activity throughout the field. So in nature, nothing is ever uniform straight across the field. There's always going to be some kind of variation. And this map of a field here kind of shows different areas, and they might perform or act differently than others, so we can't manage them all exactly the same. We're going to have to tweak a few things. Okay, so like I was talking about topography, we really want to consider topography for all of your fields when we're thinking about irrigating. We want to think, do we have weak spots in the field? Is there parts of the field that are always wetter than others? Are there parts that are always dry? Or, this part of the field always underproduces. We don't want to treat those areas the same as maybe an area that is a high performing area. So always talk, you can talk with our grow coaches here at EarthScout, or a lot of people, have crop consultants, like trusted agronomic advisors that you work with. Always talk to them, because the grower and those agronomy support people that you have out in the field with you, they're the ones who usually know the field the best, and they're going to be able to point out these different variations within a field. So some things, hilltops and valleys, those could be drier and wetter. Tree lines, roads, equipment turnarounds, even old home sites, or where houses used to be and they might have been destroyed and we're just farming it all as one field now. Although those places can obviously be different than each other, different soil textures. So we might have sand ridges, clay deposits, sides of a hill might be a little more eroded and weathered than maybe the tops of the hill. And obviously organic matter can vary throughout the field as well. And topography really plays a big part in all that. Topography, just the lay of the land. Are we hilly? Are we flat? Is it steep? Things like that. So the more we know about the variation in the field, the better we can kind of manage those different zones and maybe how much we might be irrigating in those different spots. All right. So a little bit about, measuring that soil moisture that's out in the field. So at EarthScout here, we use a Clima TDR probes. They're a 3-pronged probe. one prong, every prong has a measurement that it's taking. So we do soil moisture, soil temperature, and soil EC. So the way that these probes kind of work is that we insert them into the soil, and they're sending out an electric field about the size of like a football, and it's sending out a pulse or electric field out into the surrounding soil, and then it's measuring how much that field kind of changes based on what it's coming into contact with what's in the soil. So it just means that measurements are being taken in the surrounding soil and not just the soil that's in direct contact with the probe itself. And so when we have an EarthScout unit, a lot of times we have 2 soil moisture sensors on there. And the reason why we might have 2 sensors is because we want to measure at 2 different depths, because our root zone, depending on the crop you're growing, the root zone, we want to measure soil moisture in the active root zone. So where the plants are actively going to be taking up water. And this is going to change throughout the growing season. So our goal is to kind of watch in the beginning of the season, those shallower roots, we want to watch soil moisture there. And as they grow and the roots go deeper throughout the season, we want to make sure we have a sensor placed towards that bottom active root zone so that we can watch at the end of the season, we can make sure that we're getting soil moisture as deep as we need it to be. So some, like I was saying, some crop types, potatoes, irrigating potatoes and irrigating corn can be 2 totally different things. We might have different goals for how deep we want our moisture to be. And these pictures are just showing an install of our soil moisture sensors at 2 different depths. So in the early season, we're placing a soil sensor where there might not be roots, but in the future, towards the end of the season, those roots will eventually make their way down there. So that bottom one, we might not use as much in the early season, but towards the end of the season, it's going to be really important for us to watch those bottom roots, that bottom active zone. It's also important to remember that as we're watching water move from the shallower or the top of the soil down through towards lower levels in the soil, that water will draw fertility down with it. That's kind of how fertility moves through the soil, and we get those nutrients down to the lower root zone. So it's always important to remember how often and how much we irrigate above field capacity. That will affect, our fertility, how it moves through the soil as well. So that's kind of our main reasons for having 2 soil sensors at 2 different depths. We can really capture a full season's worth of data with those 2 sensors. So we've covered a lot today, and you can always go back and watch the webinar. But here's some things I really want you to remember, if nothing else from this webinar, is that soil texture really determines how a soil is going to behave, how it's going to hold on to water, how it's going to let water drain, things like that. Our cultural practices, our management decisions really influence a soil's water holding capabilities. No 2 fields are the same, so we can't really manage every single field exactly the same. That's not going to work out very well. There's always variation in nature. Our customer support team and our grow coaches are always available to assist with any questions you might have, whether it be, where's my field capacity at? I want to figure out where my saturation point is. Am I watering enough? Am I getting down to the second, a deeper sensor? We can always help you figure that out. And something that I took from the irrigation conference that John and I were at this week is that you cannot manage what you don't measure. So that's something that was kind of like an aha moment for me. It just all kind of clicked at that point. If we're not measuring what's in the soil, or we're not measuring the moisture, how do we know how much to irrigate with? How do we know how much water to put on our fields, and when is the best time? So remember, we can't manage what we don't measure, what we don't know about. So that's where soil moisture sensors really come into play. And with that, we're at the end of week 3. We're going to open up for questions here in the question box soon. Sarah will get that pulled up. But if you want to learn more about EarthScout, our products, how everything works, head on over to earthscout.com. You can peruse through all of our different pages there. We have a chat box on the website where we have actual EarthScout employees working the chat box. So again, we're not a robot. You're talking to someone on the chat box. You can also give us a call at our phone number listed here. And we also have a YouTube channel, a Twitter page, Instagram account, LinkedIn account, Facebook, whatever social media platform you are on, we're probably on it as well. So give us a follow on there. We like to post about our webinar series, different blogs on different topics throughout the year, what we might be up to if we're going to any local in-person events. You can always keep up with us on those social media pages. But with that, Sarah, we're going to look at the question box here, see if we have any questions.
All right. So this morning, right now, we just have one question, and this kind of ties into a question that we get a lot, and that would be, you know, if you're going to be installing sensors in your field, people often wonder how do you recommend using moisture sensors in a field with varying soil types?
Yeah, and so yeah, that kind of goes back to the whole slides talking about the variability. So what we recommend is that if you have two very different soil types, or if you have two different areas of the field that are performing totally different than each other, but you are applying the same amounts of fertilizer, maybe you're applying the same amounts of water, and they're just not the same, we really recommend putting sensors in those really different areas so that we can start to figure out. Obviously, there's probably something in the soil going on there. So when we have the sensors in place, we can start to really figure out, is water moving as deep in this one area as it is the other? So maybe we might start to change up how much water we're applying. If we're, you know, I think of center pivots a lot, but maybe we slow down the pivot on a place that has a sandier soil or is more coarse, so that, you know, the plant available water will be there because the water will just be running through it so quickly. Maybe if we have a wet spot, a waterway, a marshy area, we might quickly pass over that because we don't need to use as much water there. So yeah, having the sensors kind of installed in the most variable places, the two totally different places, 2 or 3 totally different places in the field, that's what we really recommend, so that we can start to get a feel for what's really going on out in the field, because sometimes above ground there's only so much we can do. We can see that there's a difference, but why? And so sensors really start to give us insight into maybe what those differences might be, and it could really be a mixture of a bunch of different things. So I guess, does that answer the question, Sarah?
I believe it does. Yeah, it's a good question. You know, you can always learn more. You might even think, you know, 2 parts of the same field might be performing differently, but you might think that it is the same type of soil. So you can really learn a lot once you put sensors in there. You can learn a lot more about maybe what you thought was a lot more similar than what it turns out to be when you start looking at the data. So if there are no further questions, we will be posting this later today for your reference. You can go back and reference the first 2 weeks that are live on our YouTube channel, blog, website, social media. I guess that wraps it up for today, and we'll be driving home today.
Yep, lots of driving today.
Yep, so everyone have a great weekend. I hope this was helpful for you to learn a little bit more about soil moisture and soil moisture management. Week 5 will be talking about irrigation case studies. So if you want a little bit more information about you know, where we've seen people save money and how they've done it, week 5 will be a really good week for you to tune in if this was a good topic for you today. So we hope to see you there, and yeah, have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.